One decision that doomed an entire army. The German trap at Montevideo. At 8 o'clock on the morning of December 13, 1939, Captain Hans Langsdorff stood on the bridge of the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, watching 3 British cruisers fade into the smoke behind him. His ship had just fought the first major surface battle of the Second World War, and in that moment, with his engines still running and the South Atlantic stretching before him, he made a decision that would doom 614 men, sink one of Germany's most feared warships, and end with his own death 7 days later. He turned toward the neutral port of Montevideo. What Captain Langsdorff didn't know was that this single choice would trap him in a diplomatic cage more deadly than any naval battle, orchestrated by an enemy who understood that sometimes the most effective weapons aren't guns, but rumors, legal clauses, and the careful manipulation of time itself. This is the story of how one decision, made under fire and exhaustion, destroyed an entire crew's fate before they ever realized they were already beaten. When Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, the Royal Navy remained the most powerful maritime force on Earth. Nearly 100 warships, 15 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, and more than 60 cruisers patrolled the seas from the North Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Germany's Kriegsmarine looked pathetic by comparison. A handful of cruisers, several battleships, and approximately 50 submarines. But Germany had a secret weapon that mocked the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. The pocket battleships of the Deutschland class were engineering masterpieces designed for one purpose: hunting British merchant vessels in the open ocean where numbers meant nothing. At 12,000 tons displacement, the Admiral Graf Spee carried 6 11-inch guns that could tear apart any cruiser, 8 5.9-inch secondary weapons, and 8 torpedo tubes. 2 reconnaissance seaplanes allowed her to spot targets beyond the horizon. Thick armor protected vital compartments. And most importantly, diesel engines provided incredible range and enough speed to outrun any battleship and catch any cruiser. She was built to kill commerce and vanish before the Royal Navy could respond. Shortly before war began, Graf Spee departed Wilhelmshaven for the South Atlantic under the command of Captain Hans Langsdorff. At 43 years old, he was one of the youngest commanders in the fleet, but he carried the experience of the First World War and a reputation for professionalism that even his enemies would come to respect. His orders were simple: cut British trade routes, stay out of reach, and exhaust the Royal Navy with an endless chase. By early December, Graf Spee had sunk 9 merchant ships totaling over 50,000 tons. The British Admiralty was desperate to stop the ghost that kept appearing and disappearing across thousands of miles of ocean. Commodore Henry Harwood commanded a small squadron patrolling South American waters, the heavy cruiser Exeter, with 6 8-inch guns, and 2 light cruisers, Ajax and Achilles, each carrying 8 6-inch guns. On December 2nd, Harwood intercepted a distress signal from Graf Spee's latest victim, the Doric Star, sunk off the coast of South Africa. He calculated that the German raider would head west toward the mouth of the River Plate, between Argentina and Uruguay, where heavy shipping traffic promised easy targets. Without hesitation, Harwood turned his squadron north, gambling everything on his prediction. At 6:14 on the morning of December 13th, the lookout aboard Ajax spotted smoke on the horizon. Captain Frederick Bell of Exeter turned to investigate. Moments later, his signal cut through the morning calm. "I think it is a pocket battleship." The Battle of the River Plate had begun. From Graf Spee's bridge, Captain Langsdorff understood immediately that he was trapped. Yes, his 11-inch guns outmatched any approaching British cruiser, but the nearest friendly port lay thousands of miles away, and damage in the open ocean meant certain death. Berlin had given Langsdorff explicit orders: avoid engagement with warships at any cost. Even if Graf Spee sank all 3 British cruisers, it wouldn't change the balance of power in the war. But the Kriegsmarine would lose an irreplaceable raider. His engines were worn after 3 months of continuous operations. His crew was exhausted. Ammunition supplies were running low. But there was no choice. The enemy was closing fast. Langsdorff gave the only possible command: full speed ahead. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, hit that like button and subscribe to Orders of History for more incredible military history that most people never learn about. We bring you these forgotten decisions that changed everything. Commodore Harwood acted with lightning precision. He divided his forces into 2 groups. The larger Exeter would attack from one side, while Ajax and Achilles closed from the opposite flank, forcing Graf Spee to split its attention and overwhelming the German ship's fire control. At 6:14, with the advantage of superior range, Graf Spee opened fire first. The silent ocean transformed into thunder as guns of all calibers roared across the water. When the distance closed to 6 miles, Exeter began taking hit after hit. Within minutes, her bridge was destroyed along with all communication systems. Command shifted to the aft control station, where Captain Bell, his face torn by shrapnel, directed the battle by shouting orders through a human chain running the length of the ship. With only 1 working turret, the cruiser kept firing, trying to land any blow before time ran out. But the damage mounted with every passing minute. Graf Spee remained focused on Exeter, determined to finish the fight. By 7 o'clock in the morning, when Graf Spee disappeared behind a smoke screen, Exeter's crew had a brief chance to assess the damage. They discovered the cruiser had almost nothing left to continue the battle. Unable to fight, Exeter could no longer hold the line. As she began to withdraw, Graf Spee maintained attention on the damaged cruiser, not realizing how badly she'd been hit and still intending to sink her. But before the final blow could land, Ajax and Achilles moved to attack. Seeing Exeter retreat battered and burning, Commodore Harwood ordered his ships to close the distance at full speed, knowing exactly what this meant. Ajax and Achilles carried only 6-inch guns, completely insufficient to match Graf Spee's heavy armament. But if they did nothing, Exeter would be destroyed. The cruisers charged forward, firing as they moved, scoring random hits that forced Graf Spee to switch attention. It was enough to give Exeter a path to escape, turning south to flee. For a moment, the plan worked. German fire slowed. Secondary guns fell silent, as if Graf Spee's gunners had lost focus, unable to decide which target to attack first. But before the British could catch their breath, the powerful German guns returned to work. Now it was Ajax and Achilles taking the worst of it. Their thinner armor simply couldn't withstand shells designed to break far stronger ships. By 7:40, with damaged Exeter safely behind smoke as she limped south away from the battle, Harwood ordered Achilles and Ajax to lay more smoke and retreat. The new plan was to regroup, stay as close to the enemy ship as possible to track every movement, and hope for another chance to finish what they'd started when night fell. It was hard for the battered and exhausted sailors to see how the battle could turn in favor of the Royal Navy. From the decks of the surviving cruisers, as Graf Spee headed west toward the coast, the elusive and fearsome German ship still seemed barely touched. Her guns still fired accurately. Exeter was already out of action. From a distance, the German ship remained fully capable of continuing the battle, and victory over her seemed almost an impossible challenge. But their enemy saw a completely different picture. Graf Spee's damage was far worse than the British realized. In the middle of the sea battle, a single 8-inch shell had penetrated her fuel system. Vital systems were damaged. Repairs would take days. Worse still, the oil purification plant that kept the diesel engines running was destroyed. With fuel now contaminated and no way to clean it at sea, the engines were operating on borrowed time, 16 hours of range at maximum. Reaching Germany across 8,000 miles of ocean and through Allied blockades was no longer an option. And with the raider now discovered, more British ships were surely already on the way. Nearly every port in the South Atlantic was either neutral or under British control. So, Langsdorff turned toward the Uruguayan port of Montevideo. Though its shallow, narrow channels were dangerously tight for a ship the size of Graf Spee, there was no other choice. The Kriegsmarine's warship would have to risk entering Latin American waters. This was the decision. At approximately 8 o'clock on the morning of December 13th, Captain Hans Langsdorff chose safety over risk, repairs over escape, and the promise of international law over the uncertainty of the open sea. He didn't know that this decision had just activated a trap more sophisticated than any naval ambush. Aboard Ajax, Commodore Harwood sent a reconnaissance aircraft to search for the missing Exeter. When the Seafox finally located the heavy cruiser, Harwood had no choice but to order the exhausted ship to head to the Falkland Islands for repairs, leaving only the light cruisers Ajax and Achilles to face Graf Spee. By late evening, as word spread that Graf Spee was heading toward the mouth of the River Plate, officials in Uruguay, Germany, Britain, and France moved rapidly to secure their positions, both diplomatically and militarily. In Montevideo, British naval attaché Captain McCall received orders to establish observation posts across the wide entrance to the bay, covering more than 120 miles using local tugboats and aircraft. The waiting game had begun, and the Allies weren't going to waste it. On shore, preparations shifted from battle to diplomacy. Uruguay, already under pressure from all sides, decided that if the Germans requested an extension beyond the standard 24-hour limit for a warship of a belligerent nation in a neutral port, they would allow no more than 72 hours. The British wasted no time turning the port into a trap. They flooded the city with rumors about massive reinforcements, battleships, aircraft carriers, and heavy cruisers just beyond the horizon, ready to attack. Local radio stations repeated the speculation day after day without stopping. Inside the port, British merchant vessels began leaving the harbor one after another, carefully timing their departures to trigger neutrality rules that prohibited Graf Spee from leaving until 24 hours after the last enemy vessel departed. Each time the clock reset, the window for escape narrowed. The reality was that just beyond the 3-mile limit, the only ships standing between Langsdorff and open ocean were the same 2 light cruisers that had fought him since morning, now slightly battered and low on ammunition. As the sun set, only Ajax and Achilles patrolled within sight, laying smoke screens and constantly changing positions to appear larger than they were. Every movement, every delay was carefully planned. The bluff worked flawlessly. Langsdorff, contemplating a breakout toward more friendly Argentina, became convinced that any escape attempt would end in catastrophe, completely unaware that very little stood in his way. Just after midnight on December 14th, Graf Spee slipped into the River Plate estuary. Her lights were extinguished as she crept toward the harbor in Montevideo. In the silence of night, she dropped anchor and went still with the tide, silent and motionless, her silhouette barely visible against the city lights behind her. On the morning of December 14th, hundreds of locals lined the shores and buildings of Montevideo's port, watching feverish activity aboard Graf Spee. Captain Langsdorff discovered that while he was master of all decisions at sea, on land he was caught in a wide circle of competing pressures. German Ambassador Otto Langmann spoke on behalf of Berlin. Uruguay's Foreign Minister Alberto Guani represented his country's interests. Behind the scenes, British diplomat Eugenio Millington Drake led diplomatic efforts to keep Graf Spee locked in port, while naval attaché McCall quietly worked with intelligence to ensure the deception. While they pushed for Graf Spee's expulsion within 24 hours, and the Germans requested 2 weeks for repairs, Uruguay stood firm. The Germans must leave the harbor by December 20th, 1939. When official news announced that the heavy cruiser Cumberland had arrived, Langsdorff understood his choices were rapidly narrowing. The final message from Berlin offered 3 options: pressure Uruguay for more time, break out into open sea, or fight through to Buenos Aires. But by that point, none of them were possible. Diplomacy had stalled. Merchant ships blocked his escape. The River Plate was too shallow. And whatever happened next, Graf Spee could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. As days dragged on in Montevideo, Graf Spee's crew, once predators of the Atlantic, found themselves idle, imprisoned in a foreign harbor under constant observation. Morale collapsed. The next night, Langsdorff gathered his officers and finally laid his cards on the table. The delays, legal barriers, and constant pressure from shore were too strong. Now, the only plan was to evacuate the crew and prisoners, remove all technical equipment and secret materials, leaving only a small group behind to prepare the ship for scuttling. After that, they would transfer by tugboat to the nearby German cargo ship Tacoma, while demolition charges were placed throughout Graf Spee to guarantee her destruction. Everyone had no choice but to agree. On the morning of Sunday, December 17, 1939, the waterfront at Montevideo filled again with spectators. Graf Spee moved slowly through the water, heading toward the location chosen for her final moments. Nearby, tugboats kept pace as the last of the crew abandoned ship. When the charges were set, nothing remained but to watch. Several minutes later, a sharp flash cut across the horizon. The first explosions tore through Graf Spee's hull. They were followed by a series of deeper detonations, ripping apart her engine spaces and ammunition magazines. Within moments, the once proud raider settled into the shallow waters of the River Plate. By that time, Langsdorff had already boarded Tacoma, transporting his men across the river to Buenos Aires. Along the way, he made sure the crew was fed and housed, visiting the wounded scattered across local hospitals. But with Graf Spee gone and his men handed over to authorities, he had nothing left to do. In the early hours of December 20th, inside a hotel room in Buenos Aires, Captain Hans Langsdorff wrote letters to his family and a final message to Ambassador Langmann that read, "For a captain with a sense of honor, it goes without saying that his personal fate cannot be separated from the fate of his ship." When he finished, he dressed in full uniform, lay down on a German naval ensign, and ended his life. Following this major defeat early in the war, German propaganda claimed that Graf Spee had sunk a heavy cruiser and damaged 2 others. For Britain, this battle became an early and desperately needed victory at a moment when the country urgently needed good news from the naval fronts. Though Exeter received heavy damage in the early stage of the battle, the ultimate destruction of Graf Spee eliminated a serious threat to Allied shipping and silenced criticism of the Admiralty. Reports published soon after credited Commodore Harwood with both cold-blooded courage and sound judgment in decision-making. The success at the River Plate also boosted the rising figure of Winston Churchill, who later declared, "The news that came from Montevideo was received with gratitude in our islands, and with undisguised satisfaction throughout most of the world." The British public received a much-needed cause for optimism after a series of naval disasters in the war's first months. For his part, Adolf Hitler's reaction to the outcome and Langsdorff's death was straightforward and harsh. He should have sunk Exeter. The Führer made no secret of his disappointment that the captain chose scuttling instead of a decisive fight to the end. For Nazi leadership, the loss of prestige hurt more than the loss of the ship. In the German Navy, Graf Spee's destruction dealt a heavy blow to morale. The Kriegsmarine already lagged behind the Royal Navy in numbers, and now lost one of the few ships capable of operating effectively against British maritime communications. The 3 British cruisers that participated in the Battle of the River Plate faced very different fates as the war continued. Exeter, after lengthy repairs in Britain, was sent to the Far East where her heaviest trials awaited. In February 1942, the cruiser was part of a combined Allied squadron when Japanese forces began their invasion of the Dutch East Indies. On February 27th in the Java Sea, Exeter, together with American, Dutch, and Australian ships, attempted to stop a Japanese convoy heading toward Java. The battle turned into a catastrophe for the Allies. Japanese cruisers exceeded their opponents in speed, armament, and training. Exeter took a hit in the boiler room, drastically reducing her speed and making her an easy target. On March 1st, while leaving dangerous waters, the damaged Exeter, along with destroyers and an American gunboat, ran into a Japanese squadron of 4 heavy cruisers. The unequal battle lasted several hours, but the outcome was predetermined. When ammunition ran out and the ship became a burning wreck, the captain ordered abandon ship. Exeter sank, taking several dozen sailors with her, while most of the crew fell into Japanese captivity, where many did not survive the brutal treatment. The light cruiser Ajax continued service in the Mediterranean, participating in operations against the Italian fleet in 1941. She supported the evacuation of British troops from Greece and Crete, under constant attacks from German aviation. The cruiser suffered bomb damage but remained afloat. In 1942, Ajax participated in Operation Pedestal, escorting a vital convoy to besieged Malta through continuous attacks by aircraft and submarines. After the war, the cruiser served until 1949 when she was sold for scrap, ending the career of a ship that passed through the hottest battles. The New Zealand cruiser Achilles continued patrolling in the Pacific, protecting sea communications and escorting convoys. In 1943, Achilles joined the American fleet in offensive operations, advancing through the Central Pacific. After the war, the cruiser was transferred to India, where she received the new name Delhi, and served another 20 years before going to the scrapyard. The tanker Altmark, after British forces freed prisoners in Norwegian waters, returned to Germany, where she was renamed and used as an auxiliary vessel. Many members of Graf Spee's crew, interned in Argentina, attempted to escape through a network of German agents, but most spent the entire war in camps. Before we wrap up, we want to hear from you. Did you know about Captain Langsdorff's impossible choice in Montevideo, or how the British won this battle with rumors and legal tricks rather than guns? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this story as fascinating as we did, share it with someone who loves military history. Subscribe to Orders of History because we're bringing you more of these untold decisions that shaped the world. The Battle of December 13, 1939, demonstrated that the outcome of war at sea isn't decided only by the size of guns and thickness of armor. Courage, tactical mastery of captains, and the self-sacrifice of crews transformed an almost certain defeat into a brilliant victory. 3 cruisers, inferior to a pocket battleship, managed to prevail through coordination, aggressive tactics, and willingness to risk everything. The Battle of the River Plate became the Royal Navy's first serious victory in the Second World War, and showed that the path to triumph was possible even when the odds seemed hopeless. But it also revealed something darker, that sometimes the most devastating weapons aren't fired from gun barrels. They're woven from time, pressure, and the manipulation of information, trapping exhausted men in cages they can't see until it's far too late to escape. Captain Langsdorff's decision at 8 o'clock on that December morning wasn't wrong because he chose poorly. It was tragic because every choice available to him led to the same place, the shallow waters off Montevideo, where his ship would die and his men would become prisoners of a war that had outmaneuvered them before they ever knew the game had changed.